I can get really a little cynical when I start to talk about what are the structures in the industry that keep us from being more effective in terms of leadership development. And so one of them might be that we focus development on the top and we forget about all the things that we need to focus on as people are getting up to the top. There's lots of reasons, but one of them is that's where the money is. So that's with the products we create and the services we create. But it's not an excuse, because we could just as easily sell to those people how they can help the people at the bottom of that career mountain and what they need to learn. We can make that clear, and they would be happy to buy that, I think.
More context dependent, the further down the chain you are. I mean, maybe developing a product that is also good economics for further down the pyramid or down the mountain is just hard.
And there's also more social learning, conditioning that you've gone through. By the time you reach that level, that might be more difficult to go differently about. But the business of leading.
I was only thinking at it from a business school perspective. And in business schools, I think there's three things which hold us back to be really very good leadership developers. The first thing is, of course, maybe not so much the commercialization, but we have, of course, the ranking logics. And the ranking means we are ranked, for instance, for salary uplift. That's a very important one. We are ranked for publication counts. That's another important one. For placement rates. And of course, we're not ranked whether graduates lead better in 10 years. And I think Henry Mintzberg has showed that very nicely. So I think that's one of the most difficult things for us to get over it. That's probably for the whole leadership industry, that we're more episodic and not formative. So we might look at leadership style. We might give one of the maps you like so much, where I'm not so sure whether I like this map so much, but we're not really going enough into character, for instance, which is habituated over years. We are not doing practical wisdom. For that, you need to really have a lot of experience and reflect about that. But we have to be with the persons for a much longer time in order to enable that. I still believe that most professors are not the best leaders in the world. I might be wrong with that. But there are some really...
I'm not pushing back up for that now, but it doesn't be that way.
We also like to be a little bit divas, and once you're up there, and that I find also difficult. How can I teach a seasoned leader to reflect, to be reflexive, to find practical wisdom when I am more like a Fortune 500?
As you guys are talking, I'm wondering whether the similarities between us outweigh the differences or the other way around. In other words, so much of your language is, in fact, business school, and it is hierarchical in its formulation. So I'm thinking of the war in the Middle East, or the war in Ukraine, or Trump and his MAGA base. I'm assuming you know what I mean when I use that phrase. Again, much of what we're saying we share, but there are some profound differences. This whole notion of up and down and ranking and hierarchy, it's certainly applicable to politics. I'm not saying it doesn't pertain. Of course it does, but there are times when it, arguably the most important times, when it does not. You're talking about imposing your will on hundreds of thousands and even millions of people. The notion of ranking becomes, I suppose it's technically correct, and it's meaningless in comparison with what it means when you're talking organizations, as we usually understand that word.
How do you, I think this is pertinent both to Trump and his MAGA base and to the business school style of leadership. How do you teach someone not to bring their traumas into their interactions with the people around them, like their past traumas? And how do you teach that? And that's almost like a foundational thing. Hopefully, by the time you get to CEO, Fortune 500, or President of the United States, you've learned that, but not necessarily. And how do you create a product for that? It's extremely difficult.
Let me turn that question upside down. How do you get people to understand to not elect leaders or name leaders who carry that? And that's why I'm saying people who look at the United States now and interpret it only through the lens of Trump do not understand that Trump, in fact, was really unfairly elected. So to your point, there was a book that Trump was elected the first time in 2016. In 2017, a book was a very credible, interesting book by, I think, 17 psychiatrists, each of whom wrote a chapter on being, in some ways, a damaged psyche. What do we do with that? He was reelected some years later, 4 years after he left the White House, he was reelected back. So it is the person who doesn't unlearn the trauma, and it is the rest of us who somehow either actively or passively sanction. I'm sitting here, I am going along with him simply because he's the president of the United States, no matter what I personally think. As a citizen, I would have to leave the country, emigrate.
And isn't that a case of, in point again, that you have to look at the structures? You were coming up with capitalism as well. You can look at the political economy of the US, which makes something like that more likely. You can look at the ideology, which makes something like that more likely. So I'm not sure this is just a business school problem, because of course we're also in an ideology, probably a neoliberal one. But I think you have to think these things.
Part of being a good follower in a democracy is to dissent when you need to dissent. So you need to stay with it.
I know. My argument about followership is it's all those people voting for Trump are saying, well, doing the right thing because I'm being a good follower. That's the risk.
That's where contract and structure comes in again. Right? The political system in different countries is what it is. You take the university system, Antoinette, or you take the European perspective. The European leaders that we have, that we can choose from, are probably not necessarily the leaders that we ought to have, especially in a situation like this. And it's those people who are able to navigate a very specific, very complicated system of power, and that may not necessarily be the people that are most apt at leading in the current time. So I think that's where we're probably looking too much at the individual person, fundamental attribution error, and we're forgetting about the context and building, shaping some of this.
There's a guy who's on our panel pool, Guido Palazzo. He wrote a book called Dark Patterns, and it was a guest on our Voices sessions last season. And my takeaway from Guido is that there's a lot of little problems that we brush off, that we say they're okay because they don't have big consequences, but they add up. They're insidious. They add up to big consequences. And so we compromise way too much, I think. And I do think if there's something about leadership that has been neglected in the industry, it's this idea of how do you challenge, how do you be more assertive on these little things. Principles is what they come down to. That, that he's a brilliant physicist, so it's okay that he's an asshole.
But compromise is also, the ability to compromise is also a key skill. There's a narrow path to negotiate that also has to be, it's context dependent, but also has to be somehow to make sense of that.
Canceling and opposing and is not an effective skill necessarily. This is going to be an effective way to draw this distinction of, hey, it's feedback 101. Go back to some of my coaching clients who just don't understand how to give corrective feedback or positive feedback. It's here's the situation, here's what's happening, right? Do we see that the same way? Here's the impact of that. Here's the response. Here's the action up to it. That conversation can be taught to any individual. In fourth grade, in kindergarten, they can learn those basic interaction and those skills that then they need on a big scale when they have more authority and power.
I have to come back, especially because you mentioned Guido, because Guido is all about structure. That's the pattern. And the pattern is in Wells Fargo, you didn't have bad people, but you had a bad system. So of course you need both. And for instance, we need to think about promoting systems. And that could be in democracy or that could be in organizations. Why do we promote always the wrong people? And I think that goes hand in hand. I'm completely with you that they need to have interpersonal capacities much bigger than they have these days. There are a lot of things you have to learn in leadership development, and it's often personality development, in my opinion, as well. But we also have to look at the promotion. We have to look at performance management. We have that not only in organizations, but also in business schools and maybe even in the state. If you look at different ways how we, for instance, organize tax systems, whatever. So I just think it needs to go hand in hand, because otherwise we're probably stuck.